The United Nations Human Rights Office appeared to have intentionally given I-24 News deceptive information in an attempt to cover up travel funding that pro-Hamas organizations provided to a UN official. UN Special Rapporteur for Palestinian Rights Francesca Albanese took a politically charged trip to Australia and New Zealand in November of 2023. That trip included a fundraiser for a Palestinian lobby group, as well as a meeting with the New Zealand Sovereign Wealth Fund to push for them to divest from Israel. Albanese has been accused of anti-Semitism by the American, French, and German governments, among other entities. Now, the Australian Friends of Palestine Association, which praised October 7th mastermind Yahya Sinwar as incredibly moving, claimed publicly that it had sponsored Albanese's visit. And Free Palestine Melbourne, the Australian Palestinian Advocacy Network, and Palestinian Christians in Australia stated that they supported the trip. All four are lobbying groups. Now, we asked various UN officials and entities for months whether pro-Hamas groups actually did fund the trip. Albanese repeatedly insisted the trip, which was estimated by the UN Watch NGO to cost around $22,000, was paid for by the UN, calling claims to the contrary, quote, egregiously false. Finally, in July of last year, the UN Human Rights Office, acknowledging it was fully aware of the documentation that pro-Hamas groups had said they sponsored or organized the trip, told I-24 News that, quote, with respect to the Australia trip by the Special Rapporteur, her travel was funded by the UN. End quote. They ignored requests to provide any documentation showing that to actually be the case. Since then, a 6-person panel of Albanese's peers who have long attacked her accusers was assigned the task of investigating a host of accusations against Albanese. In a letter written last month to UN Human Rights Council President Jörg Lauber by that panel, known as the UN Coordination Committee of Special Procedures, they finally acknowledged Albanese had taken, quote, partial external funding for internal trips within Australia and New Zealand, end quote, though they insisted that funding was within the bounds of the UN Code of Conduct. I-24 News asked the media offices for the UN Human Rights Office and Special Procedures for clarity on what seemed to be contradictory claims. Like former U.S. President Bill Clinton's cagey testimony in the Lewinsky affair when he famously remarked, it depends upon what the meaning of the word is. Well, for the UN Human Rights Office and Albanese, it apparently depends upon what the meaning of the word to is. The Special Procedures Office told us, quote, with regard to the Special Rapporteur's visit to Australia, her travel was funded by the United Nations regular budget. The Coordination Committee of Special Procedures assessed that the allegations concerning partial external funding for internal travel within Australia and New Zealand concluded there was no breach of the Code of Conduct. The committee noted that it is common practice for conference organizers to cover the participation costs of mandate holders. Now, with that, the UN finally conceded Albanese had, in fact, received external funding after all. In follow-up conversations, it became clear the UN was drawing a distinction between funding for travel to a country and funding for travel within a country, a bizarre distinction they failed to make for a year and a half, and almost certainly did it to avoid discussing the topic of Hamas-supporting groups paying for a UN official's anti-Israel business travel. Now, even with all of this, the UN Human Rights Office continues to ignore requests to clarify which group or groups funded that trip and how much they contributed. Accused of lying by I-24 News, the Special Procedures Media Office said it was, quote, a regrettable and unfair mischaracterization, end quote, though it still made no attempt to reconcile why the UN made no previous mention of external funding or why the funding for Albanese's trip to Australia should be counted differently from external funding for internal travel. Asked during a press briefing whether UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres would call for that funding information to finally be released, his spokesperson said, quote, we support transparency in the activities of any official affiliated with the United Nations, end quote. Reporting from the State Department in Washington, Mike Wagenheim, I-24 News.